Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of a year-long virtual series on the subject of the marginalized and the erased in history and in our own time. I thank our partner institutions, NYU's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and most particularly my colleague, Professor Marian Kaplan, and Stockton University's School of General Studies and its Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and again, most particularly, my colleague, Professor Raz Segal, and I thank them for their scholarly engagement with this series. I thank too Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, for his unflagging support. Above all, I am grateful to our speakers and to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you for your interest in this subject. The historical record is marked by voids, elided events, disappeared people, erased accounts, marginalized communities. Our series on the marginalized and the erased tackles a number of these blank spots. The history of the Roma, both in Europe and in the United States, remains obscure and opaque to many. The long arc of that history, as well as the specific assault on the Roma and Sinti during the Holocaust. At least 250,000 Romani and Sinti people were murdered during the Nazi era. Yet, according to a recent report, middle and high school students who have benefited from Holocaust education know little about them and are unable to distinguish the targeted murder of them as a genocide with specific causes and lethal consequences. The marginalization of Roma and Sinti continues in our own time with concerted attempts to erase communities and culture, literally erase, remove, obliterate. We welcome groundbreaking scholars Ethel Brooks, Ioanida Costache, and László Csősz, our speakers today. Doctors Brooks, Costache, and Csősz move between the past and the present as they plumb the history of anti-Roma racist violence and the erasure of that history, even as the violence persists. I introduce all three now. Chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University, award-winning scholar Professor Ethel Brooks serves, among many positions, as chair of the board of the European Roma Rights Center. Her current book project focuses on encampment, claim staking, and Romani futures. The title of her presentation is Intimate Recountings, Digital Circulations, Romani Stories, Familial Formations, and Reparative Histories. Dr. Ioanida Costache, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, focuses on Romani historical trauma and artistic practice. The title of her talk is A Through Line of Persecution. Professor László Csősz, historian and senior archivist at the National Archives of Hungary, is also Acclaims Conference University Partnership in Holocaust Studies Senior Lecturer at the ELTE University in Budapest. His current project explores the wartime history of the Hungarian Roma. He will speak to us today about anti-Gypsyism, genocide, and collective memory, the case of Hungary. Please pose questions of our speakers through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. One final note, most happily, our event today is held in association with the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and in association with the Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program, Education Outreach Section, Outreach Division, Department of Global Communications, United Nations. And with that, we turn to our speakers. Ethel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for that amazing introduction and for this, just for organizing this incredible series. And it's such a pleasure and an honor to be with my friends and colleagues here to launch this. So thank you so, so much. I'm going to begin, and I'm sorry that I promised the organizers that I would sit in another place without the sun on my eyes, but I realized that the Wi-Fi is not so good. So I'm going to stay here. If anyone has a problem with sort of can you hear me? Everyone can hear me? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to stay here, try to avoid the sun, and begin. And it's sort of a repeat of what Deborah was saying. Romani people, Roma and Sinti, are, we are a multi-diasporic transnational minority, and we've been subject across centuries to appropriation, slavery, and genocide. And yet, in histories of the nation state and hypervisible at the same time. So this invisibility and the hypervisibility in regimes of racialization across nation states, settler colonial formations, and regimes of belonging has really produced what the themes of this series are, and which I hope we'll explore with other communities across the year. Roma have been invisibilized in history, in commemoration, in archives, and in juridical legal regimes of nation states, and hypervisible in racialized fantasies and carceral formations of those same regimes, as well as in popular imaginaries. This particular combination of invisibility in scholarships, as I said, in rights regimes, history, and the archive, and hypervisibility in sensationalist media, racist tropes, and embodied everyday Romani life cannot account for Romani survival, for the practices that we see as cultural practices, practices of belonging, and language across centuries in the midst of genocide and expropriation by state capital and other non-Romani institutions. So part of what I'm looking at both today, but also in my larger work, are ways in which we survive, we resist, and we carry on in the face of this violence and erasure. What can Romani practices of kinship, of intimacy, of belonging teach us about historical and present day belonging and possibilities of repair, about our past and about our future? And what can these accountings and recountings of Romani experiences of the Holocaust, of slavery, of the continual survival in the midst of anti-Roma racist violence tell us about this current moment for everybody of war, of nationalism, and of racialized violence that we see across the world? And in particular, what I'm thinking about is what are the possibilities of building, constructing worlds through what I'm calling intimate archives, through love, through a kind of methodology that takes up a claiming of the living and the dead, and in particular, the dead whom we've never met, right? How do we understand the dead that we've never met? The people who have been taken away from us through genocide, right? In the Holocaust, those 500,000 people, the people whose numbers we don't know. How do we claim them as family, and how do we provide a fitting kind of practice of commemoration? And in this way, I want to think about it, and I'm going to say, something that I wasn't planning to say, but growing up as in my Romani family, one of the ways in which we would claim our dead and our ancestors would be, and it's going to sound strange, but to picnic in cemeteries, in our cemeteries, with our ancestors, and to really think about what it means to cross, to have a kind of transgenerational, communal experience with the dead and the living. So in my work, and I think in some other work, what people, what I think we have to think about is how we, with gravestones, for example, with memorial sites, sites of genocide, and with video testimonies, photos, and traces, various traces of the people who have come before. How do we engage with their memories and their commemorations through intimacy and through kinship in the face of erasure? So in that end, I want to talk a little bit about a project that was carried out by a group of university students in Max Glan, Salzburg, at the site of a former work camp, a concentration camp, that had imprisoned, between 3,000 and 4,000 Roma and Sinti, and who had then later been deported to Ravensbrück and to Auschwitz-Birkenau. What the students at the university, at the Mozarteum, had reached out to some Roma activists to ask us to write letters to people who had perished. And they had done this as a a way of having us read the letters and then providing a sound installation at the site of Max Glan as a practice of remembrance. That was in 2021. And this past year, that sound installation was brought to Vienna, and it's been broadcast on Austrian radio. But I think that kind of space within Max Glan, along the canal, where people worked, where people maintained, tried to survive, and then from which they were later deported, is a really kind of site-specific practice of commemoration that opens up notions of intimacy, opens up a kind of multisensorial commemorative practice that really speaks to some of the things that I'm talking about claiming kin and claiming intimacy. So what I'd like to do today is to read my letter to Amelie Baumann Block. Amelie was a Sintitsa who, and I've actually lost the little paper that talks about her. I'm terribly sorry. Hold on for just one sec. Amelie there it is. Okay. Amelie Baumann Block was born in 1910 in Venice. She was imprisoned in the Zigeunerlager in Max Glan of Matthias Krems, who perished in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and was the mother of Agatha, Anna, Ernst, and Frieda, who were also murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 3rd, 1943. The number on her arm was Z-6574, and she died on June 26, 1944. And I have written a letter to Amelie. 21st of June, 2021. Dearest Amelie, in our language, your name can mean friend. I want to call you by your name, in all of its syllables and in all of its richness, in its beauty, in its truth. Amelie Baumann Block. Amari Amelie. ours, our ancestor, our sister, our aunt, our cousin, our grandmother, our beloved. Amalie, mother of Agatha, of Anna, of Ernst, of Frida. Amalie, partner of Matthias Krems. Amalie, daughter of, granddaughter of. So much was lost when they took your life. The future, certainly, but also history. Family lines, so important for grounding ourselves, who we are, because we've not belonged to a particular land. We who are known by our families, our histories, our relations. You are Amari, ours, and you are mine. I write this letter to you today, 111 years after your birth, and nearly 77 years after your death. I write to you to remember you, to write you into history, into story, and into family, into my family, and into our family. Outside of the archives of the perpetrators, and outside of the stories of the murderers. I write to you to claim you as my own, as my everyday, as my treasure, and as my person. The next time someone asks me about my people, you, your family, your partner, your children will be claimed by name. I will say your names so that your memories remain. I will bring you flowers with each utterance. This is my act of remembrance, of bringing together, of gathering that which has been lost, an act of family and of familiarity, of love. In this love, I will say your name. I will tell stories of Vienna, and yes, of Maxglan, of Salzburg, and of Auschwitz-Birkenau. To my own children, Charlotte and Sarah, to my cousins, to my grandchildren, and to the world. Your memory will be present in the singing of the birds and in the flow of the rivers, the lakes and the seas, and in the canal at Maxglan. It is with me today in New Jersey, and I will bring it to my family, to our cemetery in Somerset, and to everywhere I go, and to everything I do. With all of my love always, your Ethel. And, for me, the archives themselves, are not always the place that we belong, because they are often perpetrator archives. So what does it mean to then utter our history, to speak our history, and to create intimacy through our history? Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel. Thank you so very much for this moving presentation, which also is so enlightening at one and the same time. It is both. Ioanida, return to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, first of all, Ethel, for that really powerful presentation. It was very, very moving and really took my breath away. So thank you. And I also want to thank the organizers for bringing us together, and also for the invitation to present. So I wanted to think through a little bit of the kind of ruptures and continuities vis-a-vis Holocaust era racial ideology, Holocaust memory, and present day racism towards Romani people. And so part of that is about emplacing this history within global historical narratives. And it's also about kind of teasing out these problematic connections between Holocaust memory, politics, and the ongoing discrimination towards Roma. And that's all really to kind of underline this notion that there has been a continuous through line of Romani persecution over the last centuries. So after I do that, I want to offer at the end of my intervention something from my research on musical transmission of memory. And Ethel was talking about archives, and this one moment is kind of, this song is really kind of an anomalous moment in the archive where we do have a kind of Romani subjectivity that's breaking through a usually very hegemonic and an oppressive archive that's full of all the erasures that we've been talking about. So I want to start with a quote from Orenbach Stier, who says that, quote, Holocaust memory matters because it is made to matter by and through cultural forms and institutions that mediate the Holocaust in the present day, end quote. And our panel today, as has already been mentioned, is called Forgotten, Ignored, and Distorted. And I think that's very appropriate because of the way in which Romani Holocaust memory has been made not to matter precisely through the kind of lack of frameworks. And here I mean institutional, commemorative, educational, and also historiographic that would allow Romani memory to become collective memory. And this kind of historical amnesia surrounding Romani trauma informs, I think, contemporary society's inability really to understand that this historic persecution is directly tied to present-day racism and discrimination of Romani people in Europe. So I often do this and draw a comparative through a comparative lens between the U.S. With the population of African Americans and Romani people in Europe. So in the US, scholars have been working for years to draw a kind of through line between centuries of slavery, Jim Crow laws, lynching, ongoing systemic racism, oppression, mass incarceration, and the way that these historic realities affect many generations of African Americans. And this body of work really demonstrates that the present day conditions of African Americans were created from the conditions of centuries of enslavement. And here I'm thinking, of course, of Sadea Hartman and Christina Sharp and Michelle Alexander's work. So these discourses surrounding Romani historical trauma really is decades behind, I think, other work relating to other marginalized groups. And I think we're really starting to fill this void in the last 10 years with work like Ethel and Magda Matake and Nico Fortuna, a lot of people I can't name. We're really starting to sort of fill in this void. And that's very exciting, you know, as a Romani person and as a Romani scholar to be part of that. But on a kind of broader level, European society, I think, is really far from understanding the material impact that these legacies and the aftermath of enslavement and genocide have had and continue to have on the lives of Roma. And so to kind of synthesize these points, what I'm trying to say is that, one, there exists this through line of Romani persecution really since the beginning of their arrival in Europe. We've talked about that. And that we need to draw kind of more nuanced pictures of histories of racism in Europe through the experience of Roma, by drawing attention to the racialization of Roma, especially during the Holocaust, and pushing against this distorted narrative that Deborah also mentioned, that Roma were discriminated on behavioral and not racial logics. And this will bring to the surface these kind of latent and explicit eugenicist ideologies that have continued to cordon Romani subjects off as kind of perennial others in European space for centuries. And finally, that this long kind of history of persecution has constituted a Roma subject whose life has been rendered bare, to use Agamben's term. And so thinking about this kind of the presentness of anti-Roma violence in Europe, police brutality, pogroms, and even the discrimination of Roma refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine, and I can give examples of this in the Q&A, this recognition of kind of an underlying anti-Roma sentiment requires what Christina Sharp says when she says that this is work that is encountering a past that is not past, of investigating the wake. And so the wake is what we've been talking about, that we cannot continue to sort of relegate the suffering incited by these events, incited by slavery and genocide. We cannot relegate these only to the realm of the past tense, but that these ripples and these histories are felt today in Romani communities, and that the accrual of suffering continues to affect the lives of Roma. And so I want to spend a little time getting more specific and talk about how these ripples are really felt in Romani communities today. Hate speech in Romania quite often draws on collective memory of the Holocaust, alluding to Hitler, Nazis, Antonescu, who is the fascist leader of Romania responsible for the deportation of 25,000 Roma. To give just one example, during the pandemic, a social media user made the following comment on an article that was claiming that Roma were bringing COVID into Romania. This social media writer, he writes, "Until we're able to gas them like the Nazis, Roma will infect an entire nation," end quote. So in Romania, the typhus outbreaks prior to 1940 was really leveraged by eugenicists and also leaders at the time to kind of justify this kind of supposed threat that Roma posed regarding typhus, was used to justify the purification of the nation. And this is something that Ben Thorne, a historian, has written about and documented really in detail. But this kind of ethnicization of the virus meant that during the pandemic in Romania, Roma were blamed for promulgating and spreading COVID. And it's really impossible not to recognize these parallels between these kind of early mid-19th century eugenicist ideologies about Roma immediately preceding the genocide, and then this kind of contemporary scapegoating that we see in Europe today. Both sets of discourses are underpinned by the same kind of eugenicist and racializing logics. In contemporary society, Roma are treated as literal vessels of contagion, that's during the pandemic, or metaphorical parasites within the EU space. And these ideologies have really become normative aspects of European society, and we've seen their sort of latent existence in countless examples of attacks against Roma, in evictions, and also in official state communication and policies, and also, of course, in the case of state police brutality. I want to pause to clarify that the point of making these connections is not to take these two disparate historical moments, compare them, and simply say these two things are the same. Rather, the point is to tease out the historic valences, to add it towards a minoritized people in order to reveal this latent and rampant anti-Roma racism that underpins really all of these examples of anti-Roma racism. So, as Roma Holocaust experts, we couldn't ignore the kind of discursive resonances that underpinned these historic moments. And yet, for the most part, these resonances, I think, were lost on society more broadly that maintain the same kind of biases and prejudices against Roma. Roma have been really at the center of issues of race in Europe, ostracized and marked as other for centuries, and yet Roma are remarkably absent in many discussions of the rise of populism, despite their kind of critical role as scapegoats in the discourses of these populist politicians. So I'll just name a couple examples: Jobbik, obviously in Hungary, Lega in Italy, Our in Romania. And to give a very specific example, before the elections in Italy, Alessio Di Giulio, a politician for Lega, he posted a video on social media of him standing next to a Romani woman in the street and saying to the camera, quote, September 25, vote for Lega to never see her again, so that she won't be here in Florence anymore, end quote. And so when you talk about erasure, he literally talking about erasing Romani people from the landscape of this European city. I want to return, because I'm already close to time and I do want to have a minute to play the song. I want to return to the title again of our panel, which speaks to the silencing, the erasure, and the mishearings that really shrouds the history of the Romani Holocaust. And I want to kind of complicate that a little bit and recognize that these mishearings are all symptoms of what Alex Chavez has called the, quote, deafening swell of a lethal white supremacy, end quote. And really that this failure to hear minoritized people or hear Romani stories is also about being loud with racism and drowning out abject voices and stories. And I think that what we're doing individually and here together might eventually drown out the deafening swell of white supremacy by making room for Romani stories and allowing Romani life to flourish. And so I want to leave you with just that, a song that really works to combat this deafening swell of white supremacy. Like I said at the introduction, it's a moment, it's a rare moment when a Romani subjectivity breaks through the hegemony of the archive. I'm currently a fellow in a seminar that's focused on the topic of heritage, and I've been thinking quite a lot about what it means for one's heritage or historical and cultural inheritance to be one of abjection and to be marred with persecution. And I've inversely been thinking a lot about all that gets destroyed along with the bodies of victims of genocide. There's a famous Romani musician in Romania who, before he passed away, he specifically named Antonescu as being responsible for the loss of Romani musical culture in Romania. And alongside that, I also lament the loss of identity, all the loss of alternative histories and epistemologies that were also in peril. So I want to hear this song as a cultural artifact that survived and as a testimony to trauma, and consider how it might act as a medium through which the unsayable terror, to quote Gilroy, can be expressed as a way of naming trauma and thus serving as a repository of memory and suffering. So I'll just play 1 minute, and I'm terribly sorry for going over, but I do really want our audience to hear this song. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ioanida. Thank you for your incisive description and analysis, and for indeed showing us a through line. László, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Of course, it's hard to take over after such emotional moments, and really thank you very much for sharing this song and also the letter before. The tone of my presentation will be markedly different. I'm a historian and archivist, and I'm dealing with what you have called the archives of the perpetrators, and also the hegemonic archives, and I think it would be a great point for discussion. How can intimate archives and this kind of hegemonic archives be integrated, or have some kind of combination to understand history. But first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here and to discuss it with you. And I will deal with the case of Hungary. So first, I have to provide you with a little introduction to understand. I think it's also a great way of comparison with the Romanian case, which Ioanida mentioned. Hungary lost about 1 million of its citizens during World War II. Most of them perished as a direct result of Hungarian state policies with the active participation of Hungarian state bodies and individuals. Besides 500,000 Jews, members of other minorities were also murdered by the thousands. In Hungarian historical awareness, wartime genocide is closely linked to the Nazi invasion in March 1944. Germanizing the national tragedy this way minimizes Hungarian responsibility and the role of domestic xenophobic traditions in crimes against humanity, including the arbitrary deportations and mass killings of Roma that were actually perpetrated solely by Hungarian actors. Today, I provide you with a brief comparative overview of the characteristics of the Hungarian chapter of the Roma genocide, and also problems of post-war retribution and remembrance vis-a-vis the Holocaust. Like the Jews, the Roma in Hungary consisted a special status group and formed a diverse community with different languages, traditions, and social status. They had suffered from various forms of Romophobia since the early modern times. However, the traditional time frame we use for the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust would blur when dealing with the history of anti-Gypsyism. Anti-Roma discrimination did exist, even in the liberal Austro-Hungarian era, continued in the interwar period, and certain practices continued to persist after 1945, even to the present day. The intellectual and political mainstream of the pre-World War I era considered Roma a lifestyle community outside society who should be so-called civilized and educated. However, this idea of forced integration and assimilation soon gave way to an increasingly intolerant and racial approach. The exclusionist Hungarian nation state formed after World War I subjected its Jewish citizens to a series of discriminatory laws and decrees starting as early as 1920, which encompassed increasingly more complex and radical definitions and classifications. By contrast, Hungarian lawmakers never enacted anti-Roma discrimination, anti-Roma legislation or comprehensive regulations. And instead of governmental or ministerial decrees, local statutes and initiatives determined the so-called gypsy policy. The lack of coherent legal framework actually spurred unlawful excesses. This is what I coin bureaucratic anti-Gypsyism. Local civil servants and law enforcement officers stepped up against citizens they considered gypsies by racial or social criteria in a much stricter way in their own capacities. And actually, this is the pattern which persists, we can say, even today. Besides, perception of Roma was primarily based on their social status. Authorities differentiated, as we know very well, between itinerant and sedentary gypsies, as they call them. It was mostly the vagrant groups and the poor communities living at the outskirts of the localities, mostly Vlach and Boyash Roma, targeted by racist policies. However, the well-integrated Roma groups, most of all the urbanized Hungarian-speaking Romungro, were not persecuted, with very few exceptions. The gradually declining political climate at the verge of World War II fostered anti-Roma attitudes, as witnessed by increasingly hostile articles, speeches, and proposals. Far-right spokesmen demanded, for example, the registration of Roma with tattooed numbers, creation of forced labor camps, and even sterilization. The influence of Nazi racial hygiene is apparent in these publications. However, these proposals never elevated to the level of state policy. Between 1941 and 43, the majority of Roma communities in Central and Eastern Europe, including Romania and Croatia, were exterminated by the Nazis and their allies. However, the Hungarian Roma community could live in relative physical safety until the late summer of 1944, although subjected to prejudice and discriminatory measures. The Nazi invasion of Hungary in 44 March did not bring about significant changes, surprisingly. The German army and police was preoccupied with the so-called solution of the Jewish question and simply did not have time to involve in any major anti-Roma actions. However, as the front reached the Hungarian heartlands in September 1944, anti-Roma policies and attitudes soon made a radical qualitative leap. Nationalist hysteria and fears soon incited anti-minority violence. Local Roma were made collectively responsible for the war crimes committed by the rampaging Soviet troops. Hungarian army, gendarmerie, and Arrow Cross paramilitaries indiscriminately exterminated entire Roma families and small communities for purely racist motivations. Persecution intensified after the takeover of the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross on October 15, but I must emphasize only intensified. So Arrow Cross was not the beginning of the persecutions. I think it's very important to point out. And thousands of Roma were detained in a central transit camp and deported to various concentration camps in Germany. But we also have to remember, excluding Auschwitz. So Hungarian Roma were not taken to Auschwitz, but to other camps. It has an important point in remembrance. And besides the increasing number of victims in these months, we can also document a process of brutalization of killing methods. Formal executions of men were turned into indiscriminate slaughter, as proven by survivor testimonies. I quote, "I was expecting a baby, a month apart from giving birth. I begged them, let me go, but they beat me. A gendarme grabbed me and pushed me to the departing group with the butt of his rifle. When we saw the pit and the gendarmes standing around it, we started crying, wailing. When we stood by the pit and I jumped in, I got 8 shots. 3 more groups were brought after me before they got to the end." End of quote. At another location, some 50 local Roma, mostly women and children, were crammed into a house and burned alive. Atrocities continued until the end of the war on Hungarian soil. The overwhelming majority ultimately survived the war, facing new hardships and challenges in the new post-war regime. And in the case of the Holocaust in Hungary, retribution followed the crimes with exceptional swiftness. Reorganized Hungarian authorities and Jewish organizations promptly started to collect testimonies, organized exhumations and burials of victims, and provided the people's tribunals with documentation for the trials. However, in the case of the anti-Roma atrocities, those acts came late or did not take place at all, with few exceptions. For example, the perpetrators of an October 1944 massacre were put on trial only in 1956, and it's also an interesting question why. And the verdict stated, I quote, "This horrible crime has come to light only after more than a decade," whereas a petition filed by a local Roma man proves that local authorities had very detailed information on the crime already in late 1945. Even when the events came to light, they played a secondary role in the trials, among other so-called crimes against the people. It is a clear indicator of the marginalized social position of the Roma and continued attitudes of anti-Gypsyism, often coupled with institutional discrimination, which in the following decades also obscured the genocide of the Roma from practices of national remembrance. And despite the remarkable and even heroic efforts by scholars, activists, and educators in the last 2 decades, and even before, of course, I'm starting in the 1970s, I would say, the genocide of the Roma remains underrepresented in commemoration, scholarship, and education of World War II in Hungary and in Central and Southeast Europe. Memorial events and activities in Hungary are held on August the 2nd, the International Roma Genocide Remembrance Day, as we know very well. However, as it is known, there were only a handful of Hungarian-born or Hungarian-speaking Roma among the prisoners of the Birkenau so-called Gypsy family camp. Of course, participation in this global event is of key importance for civil activism, identity, and solidarity for the Hungarian Roma as well. However, this approach somehow overshadows events that took place in Hungary, as well as the specificities of the Hungarian chapter of the genocide, and most of all, Hungarian complicity and participation in the events, without any German involvement, as I have already explained. And what is more, remembrance in Hungary is mostly Budapest-centered, despite the rural character of genocide. There is a central memorial dedicated to the Roma in Budapest, where local Roma were mostly spared from the violence, whereas some of the killing sites in the Hungarian provinces are still unmarked, not properly remembered, or completely forgotten. Therefore, safeguarding the local and intimate lieux de mémoire, places of memory, of the Roma genocide should be among the priorities of experts and activists. And I liked very much what Ethel told us about the importance of these local intimate events like picnics in the cemeteries, because some of these lieux de mémoire are in fact in cemeteries, not only because the bodies are there and the graves are there, but some of the killings took place in cemeteries. So it's like a double meaning of these sites. And besides the Budapest centeredness, we should also challenge the Auschwitz centeredness of remembrance, perhaps establishing a new memorial day for Hungary in the early days of November, commemorating the start of mass deportations. And this kind of so-called Hungarianization of the historical events would facilitate the integration of Roma history into Holocaust historiography, and of course, even more importantly, into national history and commemoration. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, László. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful overview, which in fact is no overview, but incisive and deep. So thank you so very, very much. I now turn to all of the panelists, all three, to ask questions of each other. We have about 10 minutes left, so it will be a lightning round. Ethel, you start, please, if you have questions for your colleagues.
Yes. Wow. I just have to say, both of your presentations were stunning, and I learned so much, and I just really want to talk more and work more together. So again, thank you, Deborah. Thanks, Ioanida, and thank you, László. My question, I think actually I wanted to hear more about the song, Ioanida, and I see that in the question and answer, someone else also asked that question. So I wanted to know about the singer, how the song survived, and how you found it. And I think that this, just for me to say, I think this is sort of thinking about that polyvocality is so important. And really, what is it, how these lost archives that come up, I want to hear more about that, because that was just stunning. And it was very moving. And László, I had a question about the sites. I was thinking, actually, I want to know more about the various rural sites, but I also think it was really key that last bit that you said about shifting from Auschwitz-Birkenau perhaps to Hungary. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the theoretical and the commemorative implications of kind of recentering some of this within rural areas, but also perhaps within nation states that aren't always paid attention to when we think about persecution and commemoration. That's also a question for you, Ioanida, as well. So thank you.
You unmute yourself, Ioanida.
Should we answer or should we ask okay. So the song is from the Institute of Ethnography and Folklore in Bucharest. It was collected in 1960. The singer's name is Nicolae Păun, and there's no biographical data about who he was. And so when I write about this in my dissertation, I have to do a lot of assuming about, because of the voice of the singer and the voice in the text, it isn't clear if he himself was a survivor of the deportations or if he is a descendant of the deportations. So there's more kind of work to be done to try to figure that out, although the name is extremely common in Romania, so it might be difficult to actually trace who he was. In terms of just kind of this is one piece of a larger project, which is really about how, because Romani people, haven't really written much down in the last centuries, that music can really serve as a counter history, maybe not as a historical source. There's a historian on our panel, so I don't want to, infringe on the disciplinary boundaries. So maybe not as a source of history, but at least as a source of a subjectivity, a Romani subjectivity that's informed by this history. And so the work that I'm trying to do is to talk about how are these songs really tapping into what it has meant to be Roma over the past centuries. How does it really encapsulate the sonic subjectivity of these people that really did use music as a medium of reflection and a kind of space of keeping memory alive. I think I'm going to stop there because we're just so short on time that I want to give László also a chance to respond.
Thank you so much. Of course, it's really hard to choose. And I have already posed one possible question or a possible way of comparison. When listening to Ioanida, I was constantly wondering about the relationship and interaction of national Romani movements and remembrance cultures, if I can put it like that, and how it can influence scholarship and education. I mean, how much those movements were in contact with each other, beginning in the post-war years and continuing until today, and really wonder how it can foster some kind of international understanding of these events. And also, there is a very good way of comparison as in Hungary. Of course, we have also Roma folklore inspired by the experience of the Holocaust. And I think it's really interesting to compare the common roots of this folklore, if you can coin it as folklore. And I've already mentioned, of course, how important it is for me to integrate these two types of archives. I mean, the intimate archives and the archives of the perpetrators. That's what I'm actually currently trying to do. I have a project entitled Mapping the Genocide of the Roma in Hungary, which tries to explore, collect, and digitize and distribute, if I can put it like that, documents from various state archives in Hungary and the neighboring countries concerning the genocide of the Roma. And I also try to involve and integrate sources of microhistory and intimate history, if I can put it like that. So I think these are the most important lines for me.
So as time is indeed running short, what I would ask Ioanida and László to do is please pose the questions. We don't have time for the answers, but getting the questions on the table is also very important. So if you would be so kind, Ioanida.
My question for László was about this differentiation between nomadic, iterant, and non-nomadic, because in the Romanian case, this is kind of my reference point. These categories were very arbitrarily enforced by local gendarmes and by local police. And I heard a presentation by Pavel, I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Bulan and Jan László, who were talking about the same differentiation in the Czech lands, where you had these legal categories of nomadic and non-nomadic, and yet on the ground, what was actually happening didn't marry with those legal categories. And I was curious if it was the same. You kind of already said this in your presentation, but I just wanted to hear it more explicitly if that was also the case in Hungary. With Ethel, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I feel my question that comes to mind is how do you even begin to tackle a project like this, which is one so personal and so large, you know, at this end? Because a lot of the time I feel like we're doing kind of similar work from a similar emotional place, and it feels so overwhelming. And so it's less of a question and more of I'm so impressed by the way you've been able to enter into doing this work with grace and in such a beautiful way that really brings people in. And I'm just so excited to see your book when it comes out.
So László, the 2 questions that you would ask.
You know, I already posed one of those, but shall I answer first or? Okay.
No answers. We have no time.
Yeah. You know, no time for answers. Yeah. So my point would have been this. One question would have been this: what was the relationship between among national Roma movements for the recognition for emancipation of the Roma Holocaust? Let's put it in like that. And also, perhaps it's a little provocative question to Ethel, and it's connected to this memorial movements. That what do you think? Can we talk about so-called Germanization of the memory of the Roma genocide or the Roma Holocaust, in the sense that the fact that the German Roma community was kind of spearheading the commemoration and this emancipation movement in Europe. Remember that one of the most important institutions is the memorial for the German Sinti and Roma in this sequence. And then what about those countries and national communities where there are no Sintis or very small number of Sinto, and there are even many Roma who are not Roma? I mean, many Hungarian groups don't identify themselves, as you know very well, as Roma. They are gypsies. So how to deal with this relationship between the German movement as some kind of leading force and the national variations of this movement? Sorry for making it complicated.
Fabulous questions, totally fabulous. Thank you so much for leading us out with them. And thank you, Ethel, Ioanida, László, for the work each of you does and for your participation in this event. Indeed, many thanks to everyone, speakers and listeners, for joining today. The panel prompts us to think anew about many matters, including the phenomenon of marginalization and erasure. Thank you so very, very much.